In the previous video, we talked about what happens when a sine function and a cosine function have a number on the outside. And then you saw that when we have a number on the outside, that affects the amplitude. Now, what happens if you have a number in the inside? So just like what we have here, if you have sine of bx and cosine of bx. So what happens when the inside is being influenced? Now remember that the inside is basically all of the angles. And we saw that in the beginning, all of our angles were always from 0 to 2 pi. So we were just comfortably here within this particular with this particular cycle. Now, when you have a b in here, that's going to alter the period. So the period here is going to be 2 pi over b, which basically this is going to tell you what the new period is going to be. So the new period will be 2 pi, and then you're going to divide it by whatever this number is. Okay? So let's start off with the first one. So y equals sine of 2x. Okay, so notice here that there's a 2 in the inside. So what would be the new period now? Okay, so the new period is just going to be 2 pi over the absolute value of b. Now in this case, b is going to be equal to 2, so the absolute value of 2, because that's the number that's in here. So there's going to be 2 pi divided by 2, which gives me pi. So pi is a new period, okay? Which means that now it's not going to be from 0 to 2 pi, it's going to be from 0 all the way to pi. So now the period has shrunk. So it's much faster now. It completes one cycle within pi units. Okay, now the only thing that we have to be very careful with is figuring out what exactly is going to be in the inside. Okay, so one of the ways so you need to figure out what the 3 points in the inside are going to be. So we're going to start off by labeling the middle point green. Okay, and the way that we do is that we take something that we've learned maybe a long time ago, which is the midpoint, which is taking the bigger number and the smaller value, adding it and dividing it by 2. So if you remember midpoint, a midpoint just means that you're just adding the numbers. Let me just write it as a formula so you can remember. This is going to be this a plus this b, and then you're going to divide it by 2. Okay, so in this case, the a is going to be pi plus 0 divided by 2. So you can do it either way. You can put 0 and pi, doesn't really matter. So then this is going to be pi divided by 2. So that means the inside is going to be pi over 2, which makes sense, right? Because halfway between 0 and pi should be half of a pi. Okay. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to take this number right here, try to figure out what the midpoint of that number is. Now you can kind of do it very easily if you can immediately see this. So you have to take pi over 2, add it to 0, and divide it by 2. And when you do that, you're going to get pi over 4. So that means this number right here is going to be pi over 4. Okay, which is a fourth. So halfway of a half is just a fourth. You can probably imagine what this last one is going to be. So this last one, you're going to take halfway between pi and pi over 2. So you're going to take pi plus pi over 2 and divide it by 2. So remember, when you added fractions, you're going to take the pi. So the way that we can write pi as a fraction is going to be 2 pi over 2 plus pi over 2. That's going to give me 2. So this is going to give me 3 pi over 2 divided by 2, which gives me 3 pi over 4. Okay, so this is basically a 3/4 pi. Okay, so that's going to be the new x values. Okay, so you have to make sure that you show this. This is really, really important. Okay, so now notice that my y values, my amplitude didn't change. It's still a 1. There's an imaginary 1 there. So this guy is still between 1 and -1. There's no amplitude change. Now remember what the sine looked like. The sine always starts at 0. 0, then it goes to 1, then it goes to back to 0, then -1, and then back to 0. So the curve looks something like this. Okay? Now in this case, we're not asking for the domain and the range, but you can see the domain is always going to be all real numbers from -infinity to +infinity, and the range is going to be from -1 to 1. So just so that you can just kind of look at it. Okay, so a little bit more involved when there's something inside of the sine or the cosine. Okay, now let's try this one. So let's say you want to find, or you want to graph y equals cosine of 1/4 x. You can see that there's a 1/4 there, so there's an amplitude change. I'm sorry, a period change. So the new period is going to be 2 pi divided by the absolute value of 1/4, which is basically 1/4. Okay. So then this is going to give me 8 pi. Okay, so notice now that this graph is going to complete one full period every 8 pi units, which means that I actually, when you have a 1/4 there, you're actually stretching the graph in the x direction horizontally. So the graph itself is going to be between 0 all the way to 8 pi units. Okay. All right, so now what we're gonna do, you're gonna try to find the midpoints. Now this one is not that bad. The midpoint between 0 and 8 pi, that's just gonna be 4 pi. The midpoint between 0 and 4 pi is gonna be 2 pi. And the number between 4 pi and 8 pi, that's just gonna be 6 pi. Okay, so this one was kind of easy to see. Again, you can always just find the midpoint taking 8 pi plus 0 divided by 2. You can see that that's 4 pi, and you can keep doing it that way. Notice that there's no amplitude change. Okay, so we don't have to do anything with it. So the amplitude is still going to be 1, and then -1 on the bottom. Cosine starts with 1, so that we're going to start there, and then 0, -1, 0, 1. So that's why, as you can see, knowing the pattern of the cosine is really, really important. So then it kind of looks like this. Okay, because we only wanted one period. One period. So it'll complete one cycle between 0 to 8 pi. Okay. And now let's go to the next one. Y equals sine of -pi x. Okay, so notice that you have a -pi there, so we're going to find the new period. And the new period is going to be 2 pi divided by absolute value of b. So 2 pi divided by the absolute value of -pi. The absolute value of -pi is going to be +pi. Okay, so this is going to be equal to 2. Okay, so that means one period is going to be every 2 units. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just draw this. So this guy is going to be from 0 all the way to 2. Okay, now in this case, it's really, really easy to see the midpoints. So halfway between 0 and 2 is just 1. Halfway between 0 and 1 is 1/2. Halfway between 1 and 2 is just 3/2. Okay, so there's going to be different times where you're going to have to find the period. It might be a little bit easier to just find the midpoints doing the arithmetic. So especially if you have like pi over 9, a period of pi over 9, which is a little weird. So you want to make sure that you do the midpoints, because then it will be really hard to figure it out in your head. So notice that there's no amplitude here. The amplitude is just 1, so nothing has changed there. Sine starts at 0, 1, 0, -1, 0. Okay, so, and then you just draw the graph. Okay, so a little bit more work when you're doing things where the amplitude is, there's a period change. Okay, so it's a little bit more work, but that's basically what you do. So in the next video, we're going to do some that are a little bit more complicated.